29 years old, and no man has ever asked. Jessamine's voice cut cleanly across the candlelit dining table as though she were commenting on weather rather than destroying someone. Corisande covered her mouth with gloved fingers, pretending to hide laughter she wanted everyone to hear. The dining hall of Ashgrove Hall glittered with imported crystal and silver, polished until it ached beneath the eye. Roasted venison steamed beside bowls of buttered parsnips, honeyed carrots, and warm bread rolls that filled the room with a comfort nobody directed toward Elowen. She sat at the lowest chair, furthest from her father, wearing the same dark gray dress she had worn every Sunday for as long as the servants could remember. The lace along the collar had thinned from washing. A careful stitch near the left sleeve showed where she had repaired it herself the previous autumn. Beside her sisters, draped in emerald taffeta and ivory silk, she looked like a servant who had accidentally taken the wrong chair. Jessamine leaned toward her husband, Lord Fenwick, and whispered something that made him chuckle quietly behind his wine glass. Corisande twisted the enormous ruby ring on her engagement finger, making certain the candlelight caught every polished angle before letting her gaze drift deliberately toward Elowen's bare hands. "Perhaps we should place an advertisement in the London papers." Corisande tilted her head with a bright, sharp smile. Surely some aging clergyman somewhere requires a wife who organizes linen cupboards exceptionally well. Laughter spread across the table. Two visiting families joined in cautiously, unsure whether the joke was appropriate but unwilling to risk offending their hosts by staying silent. A young officer seated near the fireplace smothered a grin behind his napkin. Lady Serene Ashgrove pressed her lips together tightly and glanced toward her eldest daughter with an expression that begged only one thing. Do not react. Do not embarrass us further than you already have, simply by existing unmarried inside this house. Elowen kept her eyes on her plate. The roasted carrots had gone cold minutes ago. She had not touched them. Lord Harland Ashgrove sat at the head of the table, carving lamb with slow, deliberate precision. He did not laugh at his daughter's jokes. He did something far worse. He allowed them to continue without a single word of correction, and when the silence after the laughter stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, he spoke without lifting his eyes from the meat. "I have arranged for an important guest to stay at the estate beginning tomorrow evening. Everything must be immaculate. Elowen, you will oversee preparations personally. Not a defense, not a comfort. Simply another instruction handed to the daughter he had stopped introducing by name at social gatherings years ago." "Yes, father." Her voice did not tremble. She had practiced that for a very long time. Jessamine tilted her head with exaggerated curiosity. "What guest? Anyone of real consequence?" Lord Harland set down the carving knife carefully against the silver tray. "A business associate traveling through the county. He is expected late tomorrow and prefers privacy. That is all any of you need to know." Elowen cleared her plate quietly, folded her napkin beside the untouched carrots, and excused herself before dessert arrived. Nobody watched her leave. Nobody paused their conversation. The chair simply became empty, and the table continued as though it had always been. She climbed the dim staircase alone, while laughter echoed faintly from the dining hall below her. Rain had begun tapping against the tall windows lining the corridor, and for a moment she stopped on the landing and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. What she did not know yet, what nobody seated around that glittering table understood, was that the guest arriving tomorrow evening was not a simple business associate. And the moment he stepped through the doors of Ashgrove Hall, wearing a rain-soaked traveling coat, and found a woman in a faded gray dress kneeling beside a broken flower vase in the entrance corridor, would quietly begin to change everything. But before we continue, if you enjoy powerful emotional stories filled with heartbreak, hidden identity, and unexpected love, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support us, you can use Super Thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us continue. Ashgrove Hall had been standing for over 160 years. Its stone walls rose 3 stories high above the Hertfordshire countryside, surrounded by elm-lined drives, ornamental lakes, and gardens that bloomed so precisely each spring that visitors often mistook the grounds for a painting before realizing the flowers were real. Inside, the manor stretched endlessly through polished corridors hung with ancestral portraits, past drawing rooms furnished in French silk, beneath ceilings painted with pastoral scenes commissioned by Elowyn's great-grandfather during the reign of George III. The estate projected exactly what Lord Harland Ashgrove demanded from everything connected to his name: perfection without effort, wealth without vulgarity, order without visible labor. And Elowyn was the invisible labor. She had assumed household responsibilities gradually at first, helping the housekeeper adjust floral displays or reviewing weekly provisions when her mother's headaches kept Lady Serene confined to her rooms. But over the years, gradually became permanently, and permanently became silently expected. By the time she reached 26, Elowyn managed nearly everything inside Ashgrove Hall. She approved menus with the cook each Monday morning. She inspected guest chambers before arrivals, checking for dust along window ledges, ensuring fresh lavender sachets rested inside every wardrobe, confirming that writing desks were stocked with clean paper, ink, and blotting sand. She settled disputes between kitchen staff when tempers shortened during large gatherings. She tracked household expenses inside leather-bound ledgers that Lord Harland never once opened, but would have noticed immediately had anything inside them gone wrong. Nobody thanked her. The work was simply absorbed into the rhythm of the estate like water disappearing into dry soil. Her mornings began before the rest of the family woke. While Jessamine and Corisande slept beneath embroidered coverlets in bedrooms warmed by fires lit at dawn by servants, Elowyn was already moving through the lower corridors, checking supplies, confirming deliveries, and greeting tradesmen who arrived at the kitchen entrance carrying crates of salted fish, sacks of flour, and baskets of eggs wrapped carefully in straw. The cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Bridget who had worked at Ashgrove Hall for 22 years, was the closest thing Elowyn had to a daily companion. "You have not eaten again, Miss Elowyn." Bridget set a warm bread roll and a cup of tea on the kitchen table one gray morning while rain dripped steadily from the eaves outside. Elowyn picked up the bread gratefully, but continued reviewing the provision list balanced on her knee. "There are 14 guests expected for the Michaelmas supper. We are short on claret and completely out of candied violets." Bridget huffed and wiped flour-covered hands across her apron. "Your sisters ate half the candied violets straight from the jar yesterday afternoon and did not think to mention it." Elowyn paused briefly, then continued writing. "I will arrange a delivery from Marchford before Thursday." She did not complain. Complaining required an audience that considered your frustrations worth hearing. Outside the kitchen, the manor operated on two separate planes of existence. The visible plane belonged to Lord Harland's reputation. Guests saw polished silver, perfectly arranged flowers, meals served on heated porcelain at precisely the correct hour. They admired the elegance of Ashgrove Hall and praised Lord Harland's impeccable taste. The invisible plane belonged to Elowyn, cracked ceiling plaster in the east corridor that she arranged to have repaired before visitors noticed, a leaking pipe beneath the scullery that she managed for 3 days with buckets and rags until the plumber arrived from town, a young footman named Oliver who had burned his arm badly on a kettle and whom Elowyn quietly treated with cold compresses and calendula salve from the still room rather than reporting the accident to Lord Harland, who would have dismissed the boy for carelessness. Oliver still worked at Ashgrove Hall because of that kindness, though Lord Harland would never know it. Sundays carried their own particular cruelty. The Ashgrove family attended services at St. Clement's Church in the village each week without exception. Lord Harland considered public worship an extension of family reputation, and every detail was managed accordingly. Lady Serene wore her finest pelisse. Jessamine arrived on Lord Fenwick's arm in coordinated silks. Corisande displayed whatever new piece of jewelry her fiancé Aldrich Pemberton had most recently gifted her, and Elowyn walked behind them all in whichever dress still fit properly and had been mended recently enough to pass inspection. The whispers in the churchyard had grown louder over the years. At first, they came wrapped in pity, Soft voices exchanged behind gloved hands after the sermon concluded. Such a shame. She was quite pretty at 20. Then pity hardened into judgment. One cannot blame the family entirely. Surely the girl must carry some fault if no man has shown interest in nearly a decade. And judgment eventually became something colder, a settled conclusion spoken openly enough for Eowyn to hear as she passed between the stone graves toward the family carriage. She will die inside that house, unmarried and unclaimed. Some women simply are not wanted. Eowyn heard every word. She had stopped flinching at them somewhere around 27. Pain had become something she folded neatly and stored in a place behind her ribs where it would not interfere with the work that needed doing. At home, her sisters visited frequently enough to maintain the rhythm of casual cruelty. Jessamine had married Lord Fenwick 2 years earlier in a ceremony the county still discussed admiringly. She lived now in a large townhouse in Cheltenham and returned to Ashgrove Hall monthly, always arriving in new gowns with stories about dinner parties attended alongside baronets and members of parliament. Her confidence had sharpened after marriage into something that cut without appearing to try. Corisande was younger by 5 years and engaged to Aldrich Pemberton, heir to a textile fortune that had recently expanded into shipping. She possessed the kind of careless beauty that made strangers forgive her for nearly anything, and she had learned early that admiration could be weaponized simply by withdrawing it from people who needed approval. Between the two of them, Eowyn occupied the space that every family keeps reserved for its greatest inconvenience. One October afternoon, while Eowyn knelt in the rear garden cutting the last of the season's rosemary to dry for the kitchen stores, Lady Serene appeared on the stone terrace above her. Her mother stood silently for several moments, watching Eowyn work with soil beneath her fingernails and an apron tied over the same gray dress. When Lady Serene finally spoke, her voice was careful and quiet. "Eowyn, Lord Pemberton's family will be joining us for supper on Saturday evening." Eowyn nodded without looking up. "I will prepare the east dining room and confirm the menu with Bridget." A pause followed. Eowyn could feel her mother searching for words that would soften what was coming next. "It may be best if you took supper in your room that evening. Corisande feels that certain conversations regarding wedding arrangements may become awkward if you are present at the table." The rosemary scissors stopped moving. For 3 full seconds, Eowyn knelt motionless in the garden soil while the sentence settled into her body like something swallowed that would not dissolve. Then she resumed cutting. "Of course, Mother. I understand." Lady Serene lingered a moment longer as though she wanted to add something, perhaps something kinder, perhaps an apology disguised as explanation. But she turned and walked back inside without another word, and the terrace door closed quietly behind her. Eowyn remained kneeling in the garden for a long time afterward. The rosemary bundle sat finished in her lap. The afternoon light was fading. Somewhere inside the manor she could hear Corisande laughing brightly about something unimportant. And somewhere deeper, beneath the silence Eowyn had built so carefully around herself over the years, a fracture she had been ignoring for a very long time pressed itself wider and waited. The weeks leading to Corisande's engagement celebration transformed Ashgrove Hall into something between a palace and a battlefield. Deliveries arrived daily through the service entrance. Crates of French champagne packed in straw, rolls of cream-colored silk for draping the ballroom ceiling, cases of beeswax candles ordered specially from a chandler in London who supplied royal households, enormous glass vases painted with gold leaf edges, bushels of white roses shipped from a hothouse in Kent that charged more per bloom than most families in the village spent on bread in a week. Every corridor smelled of melted wax and fresh-cut flowers. Every conversation inside the manor revolved entirely around Corisande. Lady Serene spent entire afternoons consulting with a dressmaker from Bond Street who had traveled to Hertfordshire specifically for the occasion. Fabric samples were draped across drawing-room furniture, while Lady Serene debated the precise shade of ivory that would complement Corisande's complexion beneath candlelight. Lord Harlan discussed Aldrich Pemberton's family connections with anyone willing to listen, reciting the Pemberton shipping interests, their textile mills in Manchester, their recently acquired estate in Dorset, and their growing influence among industrial circles in Parliament, with the satisfaction of a man reading aloud from a ledger that showed only profit. Corisande floated through the preparations like someone rehearsing for coronation. She changed gowns 3 times daily, testing how different fabrics moved through doorways and how various necklaces caught the light at different angles. Maids followed her from room to room, adjusting hems and reclasping bracelets she removed and replaced every quarter hour. Meanwhile, Elowen worked. She coordinated deliveries beginning at dawn. She supervised the hanging of silk panels across the ballroom ceiling, climbing a stepladder herself when 2 of the younger footmen could not align the fabric evenly along the central beam. She reorganized the seating arrangement 4 separate times after Lady Serene changed her mind about which families should be positioned nearest the head table. She resolved a heated argument between Bridget and a hired pastry chef from London who insisted on rearranging the entire kitchen to accommodate his equipment. She counted silverware, inspected crystal glasses for chips, tested chair cushions for uneven stuffing, confirmed that musicians had received correct directions to the estate, and arranged overnight accommodation for guests traveling from distances too far to return home the same evening. By the morning of the celebration, her hands ached from carrying trays and adjusting decorations. A dull exhaustion pressed behind her eyes that no amount of cold water splashed across her face could remove. But the ballroom looked magnificent. 300 candles filled the chandeliers above polished marble floors that reflected the light until the entire room appeared to glow from beneath. Long dining tables covered in white linen stretched beneath flower arrangements that cascaded from silver urns in waterfalls of roses, trailing ivy, and pale blue hydrangeas. Platters were being prepared in the kitchen below: glazed duck breast with cherry sauce, roasted lamb with rosemary and garlic, buttered asparagus, poached salmon resting on beds of watercress, lemon syllabub served in crystal glasses, warm almond tarts dusted with powdered sugar. The scent of everything drifted through the corridors and mixed with the fragrance of flowers until the entire estate smelled like something invented rather than real. Not a single word of gratitude reached her. Not once. Corisande swept into the ballroom that evening wearing pale gold satin that shimmered whenever she turned beneath the candelabras. Diamond earrings borrowed from Lady Serene caught the light against her throat while a maid followed 2 steps behind, adjusting the train of her gown each time she paused to greet someone. She looked exquisite, and she knew it with the certainty of someone who had never once been allowed to doubt her own beauty. As Elowen carried a tray of champagne glasses toward the serving table near the musicians, Corisande glanced at her briefly while passing. "You missed a crease in the tablecloth near the 3rd window. Honestly, Elowen, if the details are too much for you, perhaps we should have hired someone competent." Elowen set the tray down carefully and went to smooth the tablecloth without answering. Guests began filling the ballroom within the hour. Noble women in embroidered silks glided between conversations while gentlemen discussed business and politics beside the marble fireplaces. Champagne flowed steadily as servants moved through the crowd, offering crystal glasses on silver trays. Jessamine arrived late with Lord Fenwick, wearing deep emerald velvet and a pearl choker that she touched frequently to ensure people noticed it. Early in the evening, an elderly baroness approached Elowen near the refreshment table and extended an empty glass. "Another champagne, please, dear." The woman did not realize she was addressing the eldest daughter of the house. Elowen took the glass, refilled it from a nearby bottle, and returned it with a polite smile. The baroness walked away without a second glance. From across the ballroom, Corisande had been watching. She leaned toward Jessamine and whispered something that made both sisters laugh behind their fans. Several nearby guests noticed the exchange and looked toward Elowen with the uncomfortable half-sympathy of people who understood exactly what was happening, but would never intervene. During supper, the humiliation deepened. Elowen had been seated at the far end of the table, nearly beyond the reach of candlelight, between an elderly vicar who spoke mostly to his plate and the wife of a minor landowner who spent the entire meal discussing her difficulty finding reliable laundresses. At the opposite end, Corisande sat radiantly beside Aldrich Pemberton, while guests raised crystal glasses in their honor. Aldrich's father, a broad-chested man with silver hair and a voice accustomed to commanding factory floors, stood and delivered a toast, praising the union of 2 distinguished families. Lord Harland responded with visible pride, calling the engagement a continuation of the Ashgrove tradition of excellence. Then his gaze swept the table with a warmth that reached every face except one. Jessamine leaned forward during a pause in conversation and spoke just loudly enough for surrounding guests to hear clearly. 2 successful matches from this family. She raised her glass toward Corisande with a smile that contained something sharper underneath. We are making quite the reputation. Corisande accepted the compliment and then tilted her head slowly toward the far end of the table, where Eowyn sat in her dark gray dress, nearly invisible against the shadowed wall behind her. Not all of us, I suppose, but someone must keep the household running while the rest of us build futures. The laughter that followed moved across the table in a wave. Some guests laughed openly, others lowered their eyes. The vicar beside Eowyn suddenly became deeply interested in his bread roll. Lady Serene fixed her gaze on a flower arrangement directly ahead and did not look toward her eldest daughter at all. Eowyn's fingers tightened around her napkin beneath the table. Heat spread across her face and down her neck as she felt every pair of eyes in the room either watching her or deliberately avoiding her, and she could not decide which felt worse. She excused herself before dessert was served. This time, the act of standing and walking away from the table drew a brief silence that confirmed everyone had been aware of what just happened and simply allowed it. The kitchen corridor was warm and dim. Steam drifted from pots of chocolate sauce being prepared for the final course while 2 exhausted scullery maids sat on wooden stools near the back door, resting their feet in silence. Eowyn leaned against the cool stone wall beside the pantry entrance and pressed her hands flat against the surface, breathing slowly until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to let air pass normally. Bridget appeared beside her moments later, carrying a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey and a small plate of shortbread. I saved these before your sisters ate the rest. Huh. Eowyn accepted the cup but could not lift her eyes. I should not let it affect me this way. After so many years, I should be stronger than this. Bridget set the plate down gently and spoke in the quiet, steady voice of someone who had watched the same cruelty repeat itself for far too long. Being hurt by your own family is not weakness, Miss Eowyn. Pretending it does not wound you is what takes the real strength. For several seconds, Eowyn stood perfectly still, while those words settled against something raw and unprotected inside her. Then she wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, straightened her gray dress, and returned the cup. Thank you, Bridget. The cook nodded and returned to her station without adding anything more. She understood that sometimes kindness needed to arrive without ceremony and leave without expectation. Later that night, long after the musicians had packed their instruments and the last carriages had rolled down the elm-lined drive into darkness, Eowyn passed the closed door of her father's study on her way upstairs. Voices carried through the heavy oak, low and deliberate enough to suggest the conversation was not meant for anyone else to hear. Lord Harland spoke first. Once Corisande is married and settled, we must address the matter of Eowyn directly. Lady Serene's reply came after a pause that lasted slightly too long. I have written to your sister in Northumberland. Aunt Margery has room and would welcome the company. It would be presented as a visit at first, then gradually made permanent. Eowyn stopped walking. Her hand rested on the banister. The corridor around her was completely dark except for a thin line of candlelight escaping beneath the study door. People have started talking openly, Lady Serene continued. At church, at gatherings. Her presence raises questions we cannot answer comfortably any longer. Lord Harland's voice was not angry. It was something colder than anger. It was resolved. Then we are agreed. After the wedding, arrangements will be made. Eowyn stood motionless in the darkness for what felt like a very long time. She did not cry. She did not press her ear closer to the door. She simply absorbed the knowledge that the people who were supposed to protect her had decided, calmly and practically, over evening brandy, that her existence inside their home had become a problem best solved by removal. Then, she continued up the stairs in silence, climbed into her bed fully dressed, and stared at the ceiling until rain began falling against the windows sometime after midnight. What nobody inside Ashgrove Hall remembered, what her sisters had never thought to ask about, and what Lord Harland and Lady Serene preferred to treat as something that had simply never happened was that Elowyn Ashgrove had once been deeply and completely loved. At 21, she had carried warmth in her voice and light behind her eyes that made rooms feel different when she entered them. She read poetry aloud beside the drawing room fire in the evenings, played the fortepiano with enough feeling to make servants pause in the corridors to listen, and laughed openly during conversations in a way that startled guests accustomed to the measured politeness of aristocratic women. Men had asked for introductions at every county assembly. Invitations arrived weekly from families hoping to seat her beside their sons at dinner. That was before Emmerich Tarn. Emmerich arrived at Ashgrove Hall accompanying a London solicitor who had been retained by Lord Harland to manage a dispute over land boundaries with a neighboring estate. He was not titled. He possessed no fortune, no family seat, no inherited land. His father had been a parish schoolmaster in Devon who died when Emmerich was 16, and everything Emmerich had built since then he had built through work, intelligence, and a quiet stubbornness that refused to accept the limitations the world tried to impose on men without birthright. He was 24 years old, tall and lean with dark hair that fell slightly too long across his forehead, and he spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood that men without titles needed their words to carry twice the weight. Their first conversation lasted nearly 2 hours in the library, while rain hammered against the windows. Elowyn had entered looking for a volume of Wordsworth, and found Emmerich reading beside the fire. He stood immediately when she entered, which was the first thing she noticed. Most men of higher station barely acknowledged her when she walked into a room. A man of lower station standing out of respect for her was something she had never experienced before. They discussed poetry first, then philosophy, then politics, which surprised Emmerich because no woman he had met previously had ever offered opinions on parliamentary reform with such directness. By the end of the afternoon, Elowyn had forgotten entirely about the Wordsworth volume and was sitting across from a stranger who listened to her thoughts as though they genuinely mattered. Within 2 weeks, the library meetings became a private rhythm neither of them openly acknowledged. Emmerich would arrive in the late afternoon after completing his work with the solicitor. Elowyn would appear shortly afterward, carrying 2 cups of tea from the kitchen. They exchanged books. They argued about whether Byron was a genius or merely talented. Emmerich read passages of Keats aloud in a voice that made the words feel heavier and more important than Elowyn had ever heard them before. She played the fortepiano for him one evening while autumn light turned the music room amber, and when she finished, he did not applaud. He simply sat in silence for several seconds and then said quietly, "That is the most honest thing I have heard inside this house." Something shifted permanently for Elowyn after that sentence. She had spent her entire life surrounded by people who valued appearance, status, and performance above everything. Emmerich valued truth. He noticed things nobody else bothered to observe. The way she checked on kitchen staff when nobody asked her to. The way she remembered every servant by name. The way she deflected compliments about her appearance but brightened visibly whenever someone praised her ideas. "You hide the best parts of yourself because this world does not reward them," he told her one evening while they walked beside the ornamental lake as fallen leaves drifted across the still water. "But the people who matter will always find them." Elowyn fell in love so completely that the feeling frightened her. For the first time in her life, someone had chosen to see not the eldest daughter of a noble house, not a potential wife attached to a dowry and a family name, but the actual woman standing quietly beneath all of it. And then Lord Harland discovered them. A rainy evening in November, Emmerich had been reading aloud from a volume of John Clare's poetry while Elowyn listened beside the library fire with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The door opened without warning, and Lord Harland stood in the frame. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but Elowyn felt the temperature in the room collapse. The confrontation happened that same night behind the closed doors of the study. Elowyn pressed herself against the corridor wall outside, listening to her father's voice cut through the oak paneling like something sharpened deliberately for the purpose. "You entered my home under professional pretense and pursued my daughter, knowing you possess neither title, nor land, nor any prospect worthy of this family." Emmerich's voice remained steady. "I pursued nothing. I simply did not pretend she was invisible. The sentence cracked something open inside the argument that Lord Harland could not repair with volume or authority. But he did not need to repair it. He simply needed to end it. You will leave Ashgrove Hall by morning. You will not write to my daughter. You will not attempt contact of any kind. If you do, I will ensure that no solicitor's office in England will employ you again. Elowen begged. She stood before her father in the study doorway and begged with tears running openly down her face, while Lady Serene watched from the staircase above with an expression that mixed sympathy and resignation into something that helped no one. Please, father. He is a good man. He is decent and honest, and he respects me in ways that nobody in this house ever has. Lord Harland did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Respect does not sustain families, Elowen. Position does. Wealth does. Legacy does. This conversation is finished. The following morning arrived gray and cold. Elowen found Emmerich standing beside the front gate with his single leather case resting on the wet gravel. Rain soaked through his dark coat while the hired carriage waited behind him with the driver already seated and impatient. I will come back for you. His hands held hers tightly enough that she could feel his pulse through his fingers. I swear it. Elowen watched the carriage disappear down the elm-lined drive until it passed beyond the hill and the sound of wheels faded entirely into the rain. She waited for letters. Through December, through Christmas, through the frozen silence of January. She checked the post every morning before the butler collected it, terrified that Lord Harland would intercept anything bearing Emmerich's handwriting. Nothing arrived. In February, a brief notice appeared in a London newspaper that the solicitor's office where Emmerich had been employed had closed following financial difficulties. Elowen wrote to the office address. The letter was returned unopened. In March, she received a short message from a clerk who had worked alongside Emmerich. The letter was only 4 lines long. It explained that Emmerich Tarn had contracted typhus while traveling through northern France, seeking new employment, and had died in a hospital outside Calais. There had been no family to notify. His belongings had been sold to cover the cost of burial. Elowen remembered the exact moment she finished reading. She was standing beside the kitchen window. Outside, the first crocuses of spring were beginning to push through the frozen garden soil. The letter slipped from her fingers and drifted to the stone floor. She did not pick it up. She did not cry immediately. She simply stood very still while something foundational inside her shifted into a position it would never move from again. The woman who had once played fortepiano beside open windows and laughed during dinner conversations and read poetry aloud with feeling in her voice did not disappear overnight. She faded. Slowly, over months that stretched into years, until the silence she carried became so familiar that people forgot she had ever been any different. And the gray dress she began wearing around that time, the one her sisters mocked so casually at every gathering, had been the dress she was wearing the morning Emmerich promised he would return. Jessamine's marriage to Lord Fenwick had been celebrated as the finest match the Ashgrove family had produced in 2 generations. Lord Fenwick possessed a barony, a handsome townhouse in Cheltenham, a country estate in Gloucestershire, and the kind of easy, practiced charm that made women trust him immediately and men overlook him instinctively. What society never discussed openly, and what Jessamine had only begun to understand fully in the months following the wedding, was that Lord Fenwick's charm was not reserved exclusively for his wife. The first rumor reached Jessamine through a letter from a school friend who had spotted Lord Fenwick dining privately with a young widow in Bath during a week he had claimed to be attending agricultural meetings in Bristol. Jessamine dismissed it immediately. She laughed about it to Lady Serene during a visit home and called her friend dramatic and bored. The second rumor arrived 3 months later through a different source. This time it was a conversation overheard at a garden party. 2 women discussing Lord Fenwick's frequent evening absences from home and the particular attention he seemed to pay to a certain opera singer who had recently arrived in Cheltenham from London. Jessamine stopped laughing after that. She never confronted Fenwick directly. The risk was too great. A public accusation of unfaithfulness would damage her own reputation far more than his, and she understood with painful clarity that society punished wives who complained about wandering husbands far more harshly than it punished the husbands themselves. Instead, She managed the situation the way she had been taught to manage everything. Silently, carefully, with a smile fixed permanently in place and the slow, corrosive understanding that the marriage she had displayed so proudly before society was rotting quietly from the inside. Corasande's situation revealed itself differently. Aldrich Pemberton had courted her with overwhelming generosity. Flowers arrived daily during the engagement. Gifts appeared without occasion. He complimented her constantly before guests, and held her hand at every public gathering with a possessiveness that Corisande initially mistook for devotion. But after the engagement was secured, small changes began surfacing. Aldrich questioned the cost of a hat Corisande purchased during a visit to London. He suggested that certain friends of hers were unsuitable company for the future wife of a Pemberton. He corrected her opinions during dinner conversations with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and when Corisande pushed back on any point, however gently, his mood shifted in ways that made the servants leave the room quietly without being asked. One afternoon during a visit to Ashgrove Hall, Elowen passed the guest bedroom where Corisande was staying and heard her youngest sister crying softly behind the closed door. Elowen paused with her hand raised to knock. She stood there for nearly 10 seconds. Then she lowered her hand and continued walking. It was not coldness that stopped her. It was the exhausting certainty that any comfort she offered would be rejected, mocked, or later used against her at a dining table. She had learned long ago that extending kindness to her sisters was like offering water to someone who would rather die of thirst than accept a cup from her hands. But even as she walked away, something unsettled her. The sound of Corisande crying carried a weight that Elowen recognized from her own experience. A particular kind of loneliness that only arrives when you realize the life you chose so confidently has quietly become a prison you cannot mention to anyone, without dismantling everything you built your pride upon. The cracks in her sisters' perfect lives were still invisible to society, but they were spreading. The days following Corisande's engagement celebration brought no relief to Elowen. If anything, the household's posture toward her hardened into something more permanent, as though the public mockery at the ballroom table had settled a question that had previously remained unspoken. She was no longer simply the unmarried eldest daughter. She had been officially categorized, filed, placed into a drawer that the family intended to close quietly and never reopen. Jessamine visited Ashgrove Hall 3 times during the following week, which was unusual. Normally her visits were monthly, timed to coincide with social events or opportunities to display whatever new gown or accessory Lord Fenwick's money had recently provided. But something restless had entered her behavior. She moved through the manor with a sharpness that seemed to need a target, and Elowen was the most available one. "You really ought to consider Aunt Margery's offer seriously," Jessamine said one afternoon, while examining her reflection in the drawing-room mirror and adjusting a pearl earring. "Northumberland is quite beautiful in its own way. Quiet, remote. Exactly the kind of place where a woman in your position could live comfortably without the pressures of society reminding her of what she has not achieved." Elowen was arranging fresh candles in the wall sconces near the door. She did not turn around. "No one has made me any offer, Jessamine." Jessamine's reflection smiled in the mirror. Not yet. The implications settled between them like something placed carefully on a table and left for the other person to examine. Meanwhile, preparations for the mysterious guest intensified. Lord Harland had been unusually specific in his instructions. The finest guest chamber was to be aired and furnished with fresh linens. A particular vintage of claret was ordered from the wine merchant in London. The study was reorganized to accommodate private meetings, and most significantly, Lord Harland instructed that the guest was to be addressed simply as Mr. Calder upon arrival. No formal titles, no elaborate reception. The man preferred discretion and valued privacy above ceremony. Elowen managed every detail of the preparation without questioning the arrangement. It was not her place to question, and she had long since stopped expecting to be included in information her father considered above her usefulness. She supervised the airing of the guest chamber personally, checking window latches, testing the mattress for dampness, setting a vase of dried lavender on the writing desk beside fresh paper and a new bottle of ink. She confirmed with Bridget that supper could be prepared quickly regardless of what hour the guest arrived, and she arranged for Oliver the footman to wait at the front entrance throughout the evening to receive the carriage. By late afternoon, Lady Serene gathered the family in the drawing room and issued instructions with unusual formality. "Jessamine, you and Lord Fenwick will join us for supper if the guest arrives in time. Corisande, Aldrich will be expected as well. We must present the family properly." She paused. Her eyes moved toward Elowin, who stood near the window holding a stack of laundered napkins intended for the dining table. "Elowin, you will ensure everything is prepared downstairs. It may be best if you take supper in the kitchen this evening. The table will be quite full, and we must not crowd our guest." The instruction was delivered with the same careful, measured tone Lady Serene used for all decisions she found privately uncomfortable but socially necessary. Elowin recognized the voice. It was the same one that had suggested she eat in her room during the Pemberton supper, the same one that had discussed Northumberland with Lord Harland behind the study door. "Of course, Mother." Corisande did not bother hiding her satisfaction. She examined her nails casually and said to nobody in particular, "Honestly, it is simpler this way. Guests always find it awkward when they cannot place someone's role in the household." Nobody in the room corrected her. Elowin left carrying the napkins without responding. That evening, rain began falling heavily around 7 o'clock. The guest had not yet arrived. Lord Harland checked his pocket watch repeatedly during supper while conversation at the table grew strained with waiting. By 9 o'clock, the family retired to the drawing room while servants were instructed to remain alert for the sound of a carriage. Elowin ate alone in the kitchen. Bridget had prepared a small plate of cold chicken, bread, and a cup of tea that Elowin accepted gratefully while sitting on the wooden stool near the fire. Around her, the kitchen staff moved quietly through their closing routines, banking the ovens, wiping down preparation surfaces, storing leftover food beneath cloth covers in the cold pantry. "You look exhausted, Miss Elowin." Oliver paused beside her on his way to refill the entrance hall lanterns. "You have not stopped since 5 this morning." "I am fine, Oliver. Is the entrance still lit properly?" He nodded. "She is the only one in this family who asks about us," Oliver murmured to the scullery maid as he passed through the doorway. "The only one who remembers we are people." The scullery maid nodded without looking up. She had worked at Ashgrove Hall long enough to know that observation was as obvious as weather. By 10:30, the household had assumed the guest would not arrive until morning. Lord Harland retired to his study. Lady Serene went upstairs. Jessamine and Lord Fenwick departed for their guest room. Corisande and Aldrich had left earlier in the evening. The entrance hall stood empty, except for a single lantern Oliver had left burning beside the door. Elowin remained downstairs. She always did. Someone needed to ensure the fires were properly banked, the doors secured, the kitchen left in order for morning. She moved through the lower corridors in her gray dress, carrying a candlestick in one hand and checking window latches with the other. Rain hammered steadily against the glass. She was kneeling in the entrance hall, gathering the pieces of a flower vase that had been knocked from its table by a draft when the front door suddenly opened. Cold air and rain swept through the entrance. A tall figure stepped inside, drenched from head to boots, carrying a leather traveling case in one hand and shaking water from his dark coat with the other. He stopped immediately upon seeing Elowin crouched on the floor, surrounded by broken porcelain and scattered stems. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Rain continued pouring through the open doorway behind him while candlelight from the wall sconce cast long, unsteady shadows across them both. Then the stranger spoke. His voice was low and unhurried despite his soaked condition. "Forgive me. I seem to have arrived at the worst possible hour." Elowin stood quickly, brushing fragments from her apron. "You must be Mr. Calder. My father mentioned you were expected. And you must be cold," he said, glancing at the broken vase and then at her. "Though it appears we have both had an eventful evening." Something in his tone, a warmth buried beneath weariness that did not perform politeness but simply possessed it naturally, caught Elowin off guard. She had expected someone stiff and formal. A man who traveled with Lord Harland's business circles usually carried the particular brand of self-importance that filled rooms before they entered them. This man simply stood dripping on the entrance hall tiles and looked at her with steady, quiet eyes that did not scan her worn dress or judge her position near the broken flowers. She did not know yet that the man standing before her held estates across 4 counties, controlled shipping routes that reached 3 continents, sat on advisory boards that counseled Parliament directly, and carried a title that would have made every person sleeping inside Ashgrove Hall scramble downstairs in their finest clothes had they heard it spoken aloud. She did not know that Theron Calder was the Duke of Thornhaven, and he did not tell her. Across England, the name Thornhaven carried a gravity that most noble families could only study from a distance. The Calder estates stretched from the Yorkshire coast through the Midland valleys and south into Hampshire, encompassing tenant farms, coal interests, timber holdings, and a shipping enterprise that moved goods between England, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean with a regularity that generated enormous wealth every quarter. Thornhaven Hall itself, the ancestral seat overlooking the North Sea from a cliff face, so sheer that gulls nested below the garden walls, had been described by a visiting French diplomat as the most formidable private residence in the British Isles. Theron Calder, the 6th Duke of Thornhaven, had inherited the title at 22 following his father's sudden death from a stroke during a parliamentary session. The weight of it had landed on him without warning and without preparation, and he had spent the 14 years since then building it into something that commanded respect from men twice his age, and caution from men who understood power well enough to recognize it in silence rather than display. At 36, he was unmarried. London society found this fact endlessly fascinating and deeply frustrating. The Duke of Thornhaven was not a recluse precisely. He attended parliamentary sittings. He appeared at certain business dinners and industrial exhibitions. He corresponded regularly with political figures and occasionally accepted invitations to private gatherings hosted by families whose connections served strategic purposes. But he had withdrawn almost entirely from the social world that most men of his rank treated as essential. He attended no balls. He accepted no introductions arranged by ambitious mothers. He returned invitations to country house parties unopened, and when young noble women attempted conversation at the rare events where he did appear, they encountered a courtesy so perfectly maintained and so completely empty of personal warmth that most walked away feeling as though they had spoken to a portrait rather than a man. People called him cold. Some called him arrogant. A few, usually women who had failed to capture his attention, called him damaged beyond repair and advised their friends not to waste their time. The truth behind the reputation was simpler and more painful than any of them guessed. 5 years earlier, Theron had allowed himself to believe that Lady Seraphine Duval loved him. Seraphine was the daughter of a viscount with depleted finances and abundant beauty, and she had entered Theron's life during a political dinner in Westminster with the precision of someone who had studied her target carefully before approaching. She laughed at his observations without overdoing it. She asked questions about his work that demonstrated genuine understanding of business and governance. She complimented nothing about his wealth or title, and instead praised his judgment, his temperament, and the way he listened to people before responding, which she called the rarest quality in any powerful man she had ever met. Theron, who had spent years surrounded by flattery so transparent it insulted his intelligence, found Seraphine's restraint disarming. She seemed to want nothing from him except his company. For the first time since inheriting a title that made every human interaction feel transactional, he experienced what he believed was a genuine connection. He courted her openly. He introduced her to his mother. He discussed marriage with his solicitor and began quietly arranging the legal frameworks necessary for a union between Thornhaven and the Duval family. London newspapers printed favorable commentary about the expected engagement. Then Theron discovered the letters. They were hidden inside a writing desk Seraphine had left at Thornhaven Hall following a weekend visit. A servant cleaning the room found them tucked beneath a false panel in the drawer and brought them to the housekeeper, who brought them to Theron. There were 11 letters in total, written over a period of 8 months, addressed to Lord Penvarden, a nobleman with considerable political ambition and very little wealth remaining after years of mismanagement. The letters made everything clear. Seraphine had never intended to marry Theron for love. The arrangement with Penvarden had been established before Seraphine ever attended the Westminster dinner. Penvarden needed Thornhaven's political influence weakened through distraction. Seraphine needed financial rescue. Together, they had designed a courtship intended to extract maximum advantage from a man they both privately described. In one letter, Theron read 3 times before setting it down, as earnest enough to mistake performance for sincerity. The betrayal wounded him. The humiliation nearly destroyed him. Within days, the story circulated through London drawing rooms, gentlemen's clubs, and theater boxes, with the particular velocity that society reserves for the embarrassment of powerful men. People whispered behind fans and smothered laughter into gloves. Women he had never spoken to offered unsolicited sympathy laced with curiosity. Men he considered professional allies suddenly treated him with the careful gentleness reserved for someone publicly diminished. What wounded Theron most deeply was not that Seraphine had deceived him. It was that she had identified the precise vulnerability that made deception possible: his loneliness, his desire to be valued for something beyond his title, and had exploited it with surgical accuracy. After ending the relationship, he withdrew almost completely from social life. He buried himself in estate management, parliamentary correspondence, and the quiet, controllable mechanics of business, where intentions were stated in contracts and betrayal carried legal consequences rather than merely emotional ones. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Venetia Calder, watched the change in her son with growing alarm. She visited Thornhaven Hall regularly and found him each time sitting alone in the same study, surrounded by documents, with supper trays returned to the kitchen untouched. "You are building a fortress around yourself, Theron." She stood beside the fireplace one December evening, while snow accumulated on the window ledges outside. "And fortresses keep out more than enemies." Theron did not look up from his correspondence. "I am not hiding. You have attended 3 social events in 2 years. I attended enough for a lifetime before that." Venetia studied her son carefully. The sharpness in his face had hardened over the years, while exhaustion lingered constantly beneath his eyes. "She betrayed you, but not every woman is Lady Seraphine." Theron finally looked toward the snow-covered windows. "Most are better at hiding it." The Dowager Duchess sighed sadly. More than anything, she feared her son would die emotionally alone inside the enormous Thornhaven estate, surrounded only by wealth and bitterness. Weeks later, a letter arrived from Lord Harland Ashgrove requesting the Duke's presence at Ashgrove Hall to discuss a shipping partnership connected to Pemberton trade routes that intersected with Thornhaven's Baltic interests. Under ordinary circumstances, Theron would have declined and sent his solicitor instead. But the financial details were complex enough to warrant personal review, and Ashgrove Hall's location along his planned northward route made the stop geographically convenient. He instructed Lord Harland that he would travel without retinue and preferred to be addressed without title during his stay. The carriage departed Thornhaven Hall on a gray afternoon beneath low clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Theron sat alone inside, watching the countryside pass through rain-streaked glass, while thinking about nothing except contracts, tonnage figures, and the quiet relief of arriving somewhere nobody would try to marry him to their daughter. He did not think about the woman in the gray dress. He did not yet know she existed. The morning after his arrival, Elowyn woke before dawn as always and descended to the kitchen to begin the day's preparations. The house was still silent. Gray light pressed against the windows while the first embers of the kitchen fire crackled inside the iron stove. She had not slept well. The encounter in the entrance hall the previous night had unsettled her in a way she could not fully explain. Mr. Calder had been nothing like the men who typically visited Ashgrove Hall. He had not looked past her. He had not treated her as staff. When she had apologized for the broken vase and offered to arrange a proper welcome in the morning, he had waved the suggestion away gently and said that a warm fire and a dry room were welcome enough, and that he hoped she would not trouble herself further on his account. He had spoken to her as though she were a person worth speaking to. The simplicity of that had kept her awake past midnight. She was carrying fresh bread from the kitchen to the breakfast room when she passed the guest chamber door and heard movement inside. Mr. Calder was already awake. She hesitated briefly, then knocked gently. Good morning. I have arranged breakfast in the East Room whenever you are ready, sir. If there is anything you require, please do not hesitate to ask. The door opened. Theron stood dressed in a simple dark coat without cravat or waistcoat, his hair still slightly disordered from sleep. He looked at Eowyn with the same steady, unhurried attention that had caught her off guard the previous evening. You are Lord Harlan's daughter. It was not a question. Eowyn blinked. He had recognized her as family rather than staff. Even guests who had dined at the estate multiple times frequently made the opposite mistake. Yes, I am Eowyn. He nodded. You were collecting broken porcelain from the floor at 11 o'clock at night while the rest of the household slept. That seems like rather a lot of responsibility for someone who was not introduced to me at supper. The observation landed with a gentleness that somehow made it more pointed. Eowyn felt heat rise into her face. She opened her mouth to offer the usual explanation, some careful arrangement of words designed to make her situation sound voluntary and comfortable rather than what it actually was. But something about the way he was looking at her, patient, direct, free of judgment but clearly unwilling to accept a rehearsed answer, stopped the familiar script before it reached her lips. My father prefers a small table for business guests. I oversee household arrangements. It suits everyone well. Theron studied her for a moment longer. Then a faint, barely visible shift moved across his expression. Not a smile exactly. Something closer to recognition. It suits everyone except you, I suspect. Eowyn could not answer that honestly, without dismantling something she had spent years constructing. So she simply held his gaze for a moment, then lowered her eyes politely. Breakfast is ready whenever you wish, Mr. Calder. She turned and walked toward the kitchen before the conversation could deepen further. But she carried the weight of that sentence with her through the entire morning. It suits everyone except you. Nobody had ever said anything like that to her. Nobody had even thought to look closely enough to notice. The formal introduction came that evening at supper. Lord Harland had dressed with unusual care and arranged the dining table to project maximum elegance. Silver candelabras burned at measured intervals. The finest claret had been decanted for 2 hours. Jessamine and Lord Fenwick attended in their best evening attire, while Corisande wore a new cream silk gown with pearl buttons that Aldrich had sent from London, specifically for the occasion. Eowyn had been told once again to eat in the kitchen, but this time, Theron interrupted the arrangement before it took hold. He had entered the dining room precisely on time, greeting Lord Harland with the courteous but minimal formality of a man who did not enjoy ceremony. Introductions moved around the table. Lord Fenwick, Jessamine, Corisande, Aldrich, Lady Serene. Each person received a polite nod and brief acknowledgement. Then Theron glanced at the table settings, counted the chairs, and turned to Lord Harland with an expression of mild curiosity. I had the pleasure of meeting your eldest daughter last evening, and again this morning. Will Miss Ashgrove not be joining us? A fractional silence passed through the room. Lord Harland's composure flickered for barely a second before recovering. Eowyn typically supervises arrangements during formal suppers. She prefers to ensure everything runs smoothly from the household side. Theron held Lord Harland's gaze for a beat longer than comfortable. I see. Then perhaps an additional place could be set. I find conversation improves considerably, with more perspectives at the table. It was not a request. The phrasing carried the quiet, unmistakable weight of a man accustomed to having his preferences treated as decisions. Lord Harland hesitated for only a moment, before nodding to a servant. Of course, a small adjustment. Within minutes, Eowyn was summoned from the kitchen. She arrived in the dining room, still wearing her gray dress, her hair pinned hastily back from her face, her hands smelling faintly of the rosemary she had been sorting for Bridget. She looked completely unlike the polished women seated around the candlelit table and entirely aware of it. Corisande's expression tightened visibly. Jessamine exchanged a glance with Lord Fenwick that contained something between amusement and disbelief. But Theron simply gestured toward the empty chair beside him as though the entire arrangement had been planned from the beginning. Eowyn sat down carefully, acutely aware of the contrast between her plain dress and the silk, pearl, and candlelight surrounding her. Corisande's cream gown caught the light every time she moved. Jessamine's emerald earrings sparkled deliberately whenever she turned her head. Elowen's hands, still faintly stained from sorting dried herbs, rested in her lap beneath the tablecloth where she hoped nobody would notice them. The meal began with a chilled watercress soup, followed by roasted guinea fowl with tarragon butter and braised leeks. Conversation moved politely through the usual channels. Lord Harland steered discussion toward shipping tariffs and port access. Aldrich offered opinions about manufacturing costs with the rehearsed confidence of a man who enjoyed hearing himself quoted. Midway through the second course, a young kitchen maid entered, carrying a heavy tureen of sauce. The girl was new, hired only the previous week, and her hands shook visibly as she approached the table. As she leaned forward to set the tureen beside the guinea fowl, her elbow caught the edge of a bread plate. The plate slid toward the table's edge with a sound that made every guest pause. Elowen caught it. Her hand moved instinctively, steadying the plate before it fell, and in the same motion she placed her other hand gently on the girl's wrist. "You are doing well," she murmured quietly enough that only the maid and the guest beside her could hear. "Take a breath. There is no hurry." The girl's trembling steadied. She set the tureen down successfully and retreated toward the kitchen with a grateful glance that lasted barely a second but carried genuine relief. Nobody else at the table acknowledged the moment. Lord Harland continued speaking about Baltic grain shipments without interruption. Jessamine examined her soup spoon with exaggerated boredom. Corisande had not even looked up. But Theron had watched the entire exchange in silence, and something shifted behind his eyes that Elowen did not see because she had already turned her attention back to her plate. During supper, something happened that nobody at the table expected. Theron directed most of his conversation toward Elowen, not exclusively, and never rudely enough to slight the other guests. But consistently, he asked her about the estate's history and how long the gardens had been maintained in their current design. He inquired about the stillroom and whether the household produced its own remedies or relied on apothecaries from town. He listened to her describe Bridget's approach to seasonal preserves with more genuine interest than he had shown toward Lord Harland's shipping proposals. When Elowen mentioned that 2 of the elm trees lining the main drive had been lost to disease the previous winter, Theron asked whether she had arranged replacements. She told him she had sourced saplings from a nursery in Suffolk and planted them herself on a cold morning in March. "You planted them yourself?" The gaps in the avenue were noticeable from the road. Nobody else was available. Theron studied her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Most people who inherit beautiful things assume they will maintain themselves." Elowen spoke carefully at first, unaccustomed to being heard at her own family's table. But Theron's attention was not flattering in the way that made her self-conscious. It was simply present. He asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening rather than performing interest. He made one dry observation about the difference between managing estates and merely owning them that made Elowen smile before she could stop herself. Across the table, Jessamine's smile had frozen into something that resembled a portrait left hanging too long in direct sunlight. Corisande was gripping her wine-glass stem with unnecessary force. Aldrich glanced between Theron and Elowen with the dawning suspicion that the evening's most important conversation was not the one about shipping tariffs. Lord Harland's expression had shifted from polished host to something unsettled that he could not quite arrange back into place. And Elowen did not yet know why a visiting business associate would choose to direct his attention toward the least important person at the table. She did not yet know what it meant. But the rest of the household was beginning to realize, with varying degrees of alarm, that Mr. Calder was not behaving like a man interested in shipping contracts. Over the following days, Theron extended his stay at Ashgrove Hall twice. The first extension he attributed to unresolved details in the trade discussion with Lord Harland. The second he did not explain at all. Each morning, Elowen found him awake early, often walking the grounds alone while mist still clung to the gardens. He began appearing in the kitchen corridor to collect his own tea rather than waiting for it to be brought upstairs. And Bridget, who mistrusted every guest who had ever entered Ashgrove Hall on principle, observed after 3 days that Mr. Calder was the first visitor in 22 years who had thanked her for a meal without being prompted. Conversations between Theron and Elowen lengthened without either of them openly acknowledging it. He found her in the garden one afternoon, transplanting winter herbs, and knelt beside her without hesitation, helping separate tangled root systems while she explained which plants would survive frost and which needed to be brought inside before November. His hands were careful with the stems. He asked whether she had learned from books or from practice, and she told him both, and that Bridget's mother had taught her the medicinal uses of most of what grew in the still-room beds. He told her about the cliffs at Thornhaven Hall, where wild thyme grew between the rocks and the wind carried salt from the sea into the gardens no matter how carefully the walls were built to block it. It sounds beautiful. It is, and it is very lonely. The honesty in that sentence stopped her hands in the soil. She looked at him, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, while something unguarded passed between them that neither was prepared to name. Inside the manor, the atmosphere shifted rapidly. Lord Harlan's demeanor toward Elowyn changed with a speed that would have been comical if it were not so transparently self-serving. He began addressing her by name at meals. He asked her opinion about household matters in front of Theron. He introduced her to a visiting solicitor as my eldest daughter, a young woman of considerable ability, as though this had always been his position, rather than something adopted overnight because a wealthy man appeared to find her interesting. Lady Serene's transformation was equally dramatic. Expensive fabric samples arrived from London within days. A dressmaker was summoned to take Elowyn's measurements, while Lady Serene supervised with an enthusiasm she had never previously directed toward her eldest daughter's appearance. "You must wear something more suitable for dinner this evening." Lady Serene held up a length of dove gray silk that probably cost more than Elowyn's entire existing wardrobe. First impressions matter enormously with men of Mr. Calder's standing. Elowyn studied the fabric without expression. He met me while I was kneeling on the floor in a worn dress, picking up broken porcelain. "Mother, I believe the first impression has already been established." Lady Serene chose not to hear that. But while her parents scrambled to reposition themselves, her sisters reacted with precisely the opposite energy. Jessamine's hostility sharpened into something deliberate and strategic. She began making pointed comments during meals about Elowyn's age, her lack of social experience, and the peculiarity of a sophisticated gentleman showing sustained interest in a woman who spent more time in the kitchen than in the drawing room. "One does wonder," Jessamine mused one afternoon loud enough for 3 rooms to hear, "what exactly he finds so fascinating about a woman who smells of rosemary and candle wax." Corisonde's cruelty was blunter. She intercepted Elowyn in the corridor one evening before supper and stood directly in her path with arms crossed. "You must realize this cannot be genuine. He is bored. He is trapped in a country house with limited company, and you happen to be available. Once he returns to London and remembers what actual society looks like, this absurd little performance will end, and you will be exactly where you were before, alone and unwanted." Elowyn walked past her without answering, but the words lodged themselves in the part of her chest that still believed every cruel thing her family had ever told her. 2 days later, the situation escalated further. Jessamine, who had maintained correspondence with several families across the county, quietly arranged for Lady Seraphine Duval to be invited to a supper hosted by the Pembertons that both the Ashgrove family and Theron were expected to attend. Seraphine arrived in midnight blue velvet, with diamonds at her throat, and the particular confidence of a woman who knew exactly what effect she had on men. She had heard through society's relentless gossip channels that the Duke of Thornhaven was staying at a country estate in Hertfordshire, and the invitation provided precisely the proximity she needed. Throughout the evening, Seraphine positioned herself beside Theron at every opportunity. She referenced old acquaintances, shared memories, and laughed in a way designed to demonstrate an intimacy that no other woman in the room could match. Elowyn watched from the opposite end of the table and felt something cold tighten around her ribs. She did not yet know who Seraphine was. She only understood that this woman moved through the world with the kind of effortless beauty and social power that Elowyn had never possessed and never would. Then Seraphine leaned close to Theron and murmured just loudly enough for nearby guests to catch. "You seem different, Theron. Softer, somehow. I wonder who is responsible for that." Theron's expression did not change. He set down his wine glass and replied without lowering his voice. I am more careful now. That is not the same as softer. And the person responsible for teaching me that particular lesson is seated beside me. Seraphine's smile collapsed. The table fell silent. Jessamine stared at her plate. Corisande looked as though she had swallowed something sharp. Later that evening, after returning to Ashgrove Hall, Theron was walking through the upper corridor toward his guest chamber when voices stopped him beside the drawing room door. It was slightly ajar, and lamplight spilled into the hallway alongside words that were clearly never intended for anyone outside the room. Jessamine spoke first. She is making a fool of herself and humiliating this family in the process. Corisande's voice came next, tight with anger. A man like that does not choose a woman like Elowen. She is simply convenient. The moment he leaves this house, he will forget she exists. Lady Serene's voice was quieter, more measured, but no less cutting. Perhaps it is best not to encourage this further. Elowen is not equipped for the world a man of his position occupies. She would embarrass herself and us. Theron pushed the door open without announcing himself. The three women turned toward him in visible shock. Lady Serene's teacup rattled against its saucer. Jessamine went pale. Corisande opened her mouth and then closed it without producing a sound. Theron stood in the doorway with an expression that carried no anger on its surface. His voice was controlled, level, and absolutely precise. Miss Elowen Ashgrove has shown me more genuine decency in 1 week than I have encountered in 5 years of London society. She has treated every servant in this household with more respect than her own family has ever shown her. She has managed this estate with more competence than most stewards I employ across 4 counties. And she has done all of this while enduring cruelty from the people who should have valued her most. Nobody moved. You speak of embarrassment, but the only embarrassment I have witnessed inside this house has come from this room, and it has never once come from her. He turned and walked away before anyone could respond. The drawing room remained silent for a very long time afterward. Much later that night, Theron found Elowen sitting alone in the dark garden beneath a sky that had finally cleared enough to show stars. She had been crying. She tried to hide it immediately when she heard footsteps on the gravel, wiping her face with the back of her hand and straightening her posture into something composed. He sat beside her on the stone bench without asking permission. You heard what they said. Elowen's voice was small and rough from tears. Yes. A long silence passed. Night air moved through the garden, carrying the scent of late roses and damp earth. Nobody in my life has ever spoken for me the way you did tonight. Her voice broke slightly on the final word. I have spent so many years being invisible that I forgot it was possible for someone to see me at all. Theron did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. I spent 5 years believing that no one would ever look at me without calculating what they could take. You looked at me on the first night we met, soaking wet and unannounced, and offered me warmth without knowing anything about me except that I was cold. That is not invisible, Elowen. That is the rarest thing I have ever encountered. She could not speak after that. She simply sat beside him while tears she no longer tried to hide ran silently down her face, and the stars turned slowly overhead. What she did not know, what he had not yet told her, was that the man she knew as Mr. Calder had written to his solicitor in London 3 days earlier, requesting the retrieval of his grandmother's engagement ring from the Thornhaven family vault, and what neither of them knew was that the ring was already on its way. The midwinter ball at Hartfield Park was the most anticipated social event in the county. Lord Barrington, the Lord Lieutenant, hosted the gathering annually inside the enormous gilded ballroom of his estate, and attendance was considered both a privilege and a public measure of one's social standing. Invitations were managed with diplomatic care. The families who attended understood that being seen at Hartfield carried almost as much weight as any formal title. This year, the guest list carried an additional detail that had set the entire county buzzing with speculation. The Duke of Thornhaven had accepted Lord Barrington's invitation personally. It was the first social event Theron Calder had attended publicly in over 2 years, and the fact that he had agreed to appear at a county ball rather than a London gathering sent a clear signal that something significant had shifted in his private world. Ashgrove Hall spent the days before the ball in feverish preparation. Lady Serene ordered gowns for both younger daughters from the same Bond Street dressmaker, ensuring that Jessamine and Corisande would appear flawless beneath the chandeliers. Lord Harland rehearsed conversational points about shipping partnerships in case the Duke introduced him to Lord Barrington's circle. For Elowen, a gown was provided almost as an afterthought. Lady Serene selected a pale silver dress with simple lines that she described as elegant but understated, clearly intending for Elowen to appear presentable without competing visually with her younger sisters. Elowen accepted it without comment. She had stopped caring about fabric months ago. Something far more terrifying and wonderful had begun occupying the space inside her chest where fabric and appearance had once mattered. The evening of the ball arrived beneath a sky heavy with winter clouds. Snow had begun falling lightly as the Ashgrove carriages departed the estate, and by the time they reached Hartfield Park, the grounds were dusted white beneath hundreds of lanterns lining the drive. Inside, the ballroom exceeded every expectation. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with classical scenes of mythology and harvest. Enormous fireplaces roared at both ends of the room while long tables overflowed with roasted pheasant, glazed ham, poached pears and wine, sugared almonds, cream pastries, and towers of fruit arranged between silver candelabras. Musicians played from a raised gallery overlooking the dance floor, and the scent of pine boughs, mulled wine, and beeswax candles filled the air with the unmistakable atmosphere of celebration. Elowen had never felt more exposed. Standing inside Hartfield Park, surrounded by the most prominent families in the county, she felt every familiar insecurity return with punishing force. Women, younger and more beautiful, moved effortlessly through the crowd. Laughter came easily to people who had spent their entire lives belonging to rooms like this one. Elowen stood near the edge of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne she had not tasted and reminding herself to breathe. Jessamine noticed her discomfort immediately and leaned toward Corisande with quiet satisfaction. He has not arrived yet. Perhaps tonight reality finally introduces itself. Corisande adjusted her pearl necklace and scanned the entrance with an expression balanced between hope and malice. Every beautiful woman in the county is here. Whatever spell she cast inside a country kitchen will not survive this room. Across the ballroom, Lady Seraphine Duval entered, wearing deep burgundy silk that caught the firelight like something molten. Conversations shifted immediately toward her beauty, while women stepped aside to watch her move through the crowd with the practiced confidence of someone who understood exactly how much space the world would always make for her. Then the Duke of Thornhaven arrived. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Women straightened instinctively. Mothers gripped their daughters' arms with sudden urgency, while whispering instructions through fixed smiles. Lord Barrington himself crossed the ballroom to greet Theron personally, and within moments, a gravitational shift had reorganized the entire room around his presence. For the first time, Elowen heard his full title spoken aloud. His Grace, the Duke of Thornhaven. The words hit her like cold water. Duke, not Mr. Calder, not a business associate, not a traveling gentleman seeking privacy during a quiet country visit. The Duke of Thornhaven. The wealthiest, most powerful, most sought-after unmarried nobleman in England. The man who had knelt beside her in the garden sorting herb roots. The man who had sat with her beneath the stars while she cried. The man who had defended her against her own family without hesitation, and spoken to her every day for 2 weeks as though she were the only person in any room worth hearing. Elowen's champagne glass trembled in her hand. She set it down on the nearest table before anyone noticed. Around her, the machinery of society lurched into motion. Young women positioned themselves along Theron's path. Seraphine moved closer through the crowd with calm, predatory patience. Ambitious mothers maneuvered daughters into conversational range. The entire ballroom oriented itself toward him like iron filings drawn toward a magnet. But Theron was already moving. His eyes had found Elowen the moment he entered the room, and he walked toward her with the unhurried certainty of a man who had made a decision long before arriving. In his hand, held low against his side where only someone watching closely would notice, rested a small velvet box. The music softened. Whispers cascaded through the ballroom like wind moving through dry leaves. Every eye followed the Duke of Thornhaven as he crossed the polished floor, passing Seraphine without a glance, passing every celebrated beauty in the county, passing Jessamine and Corisande, who stood frozen beside their husbands, with expressions that shifted from confusion to disbelief to something approaching fear. He stopped directly before Elowin. The ballroom fell completely silent. 300 guests held their breath beneath the chandeliers of Hartfield Park, while snow continued falling silently beyond the tall windows. Theron opened the velvet box slowly. Inside, resting against dark silk, lay a ring of extraordinary beauty, a pale blue sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight and scattered it outward like captured stars. Then the Duke of Thornhaven spoke, and his voice carried across the silent ballroom with the steady clarity of a man who had chosen every word long before this moment. Miss Elowin Ashgrove, I have spent years inside rooms filled with people who valued beauty above character, status above substance, and ambition above kindness. I built walls around myself because I believed that was the only way to survive a world that rewards performance and punishes sincerity. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then I arrived at your father's house unannounced, soaking wet and without title, and a woman in a gray dress knelt on a stone floor and offered me warmth without knowing anything about me except that I needed it. Elowin's vision blurred. Her hands rose involuntarily to cover her mouth, while tears she could not control began falling openly. You treated servants with more dignity than most nobles show their equals. You managed an entire household without recognition, without thanks, and without ever allowing the cruelty directed at you to harden the kindness you carried inside. You spoke to me honestly when every other person I have met in a decade spoke to my title instead. Jessamine's face had drained of all color. Corisande gripped Aldrich's arm as though the floor beneath her were shifting. Lord Harland stared at his eldest daughter as though seeing someone he had never previously noticed standing inside his own house. Lady Serene's hand was pressed against her chest, and the expression on her face was not shock. It was something deeper and more painful. It was the sudden, devastating recognition that she had spent years trying to remove the most valuable person in her family. Theron stepped closer. His voice dropped lower, but in the absolute silence of the ballroom, every word reached every corner. I did not tell you who I was, because I needed to know whether someone could see me clearly without my title standing between us. You did. Every single day. And I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this. He held the ring toward her. Elowin Ashgrove, will you honor me by becoming the Duchess of Thornhaven? A sound escaped Elowin that she could not have described. It was not a word. It was the sound of years of silence, humiliation, loneliness, and grief breaking apart inside her chest all at once. Tears fell without restraint. Her entire body trembled while the ballroom watched, and the snow fell, and the chandeliers burned above them both. She nodded before she could speak, and when her voice finally came, it was barely a whisper that carried further than any shout could have. Yes. Applause erupted across Hartfield Park. 300 guests rose to their feet while the orchestra, responding instinctively, began a waltz that filled the ballroom with music that sounded, to Elowin, like the first beautiful thing she had heard in years. Lady Seraphine turned and walked toward the exit without looking back. Jessamine lowered her eyes completely. Corisande stood motionless beside Aldrich, who had released her arm and was staring at the floor. Lord Harland remained seated while something heavy and irreversible settled across his face, but it was Lady Serene who carried the most visible wound. She sat perfectly still while tears ran down her cheeks in full view of 300 guests, and the expression she wore was not embarrassment or shock or even regret. It was grief. The specific, irreparable grief of a mother who finally understood, far too late, exactly what she had devoted years to discarding. Years passed after that night at Hartfield Park. Elowin Ashgrove became the Duchess of Thornhaven, and the life that followed was nothing like the one she had been told to expect. She did not become beloved across England because of her title. She became beloved because she carried into Thornhaven Hall the same quiet goodness that had defined her long before anyone noticed it. She remembered every servant by name. She visited tenants during illness and brought food personally. She opened the estate grounds to village families during summer months and established a fund for educating the children of estate workers. Theron, who had believed for years that genuine feeling no longer existed in his world, discovered slowly and then completely that he had been wrong. Eowyn did not perform affection. She simply loved him, steadily and without condition, in a way that dismantled every wall he had built without requiring him to tear them down himself. They walked the cliff gardens of Thornhaven together in the evenings while the North Sea crashed against the rocks below, and he told her once that she had saved something inside him he had believed was already dead. Meanwhile, the lives her sisters had built so proudly and so publicly continued to fracture. Lord Fenwick's indiscretions became impossible to conceal. His prolonged absences and mounting secret debts surfaced publicly, and the truth of where his time and fortune had been disappearing reached Jessamine through sources she could no longer dismiss. Jessamine's social standing, the foundation upon which her entire identity had been constructed, crumbled beneath the weight of gossip she could not outrun. She retreated from public life almost entirely, humiliated by the very society she had worked her entire life to impress. Aldrich Pemberton's controlling nature intensified steadily after the wedding until Corisonde's life became a series of permissions requested and frequently denied. She wore what he approved. She visited whom he allowed. The ruby ring she had once displayed so triumphantly at Ashgrove Hall now represented something she could not name openly, but felt every time she looked at it. One winter afternoon, 3 years after the midwinter ball, 2 carriages arrived at the gates of Thornhaven Hall. They were not fine carriages. The paint was chipped on one, and a wheel spoke had been repaired with rope on the other. Inside sat Jessamine and Corisonde, wearing gowns that had once been expensive but now showed the unmistakable signs of women whose circumstances had changed dramatically. They were shown into the drawing room, where a fire burned warmly and the scent of tea and fresh bread drifted from the kitchen below. Eowyn received them calmly. She did not gloat. She did not reference the years of mockery, the dining tables where she had been erased, the corridors where her worth had been dismissed with laughter. She poured tea with steady hands, offered warm bread and butter, and listened while her sisters, unable to meet her eyes for longer than a moment, sat in silence and slowly began to understand the shape of what they had lost and what she had always carried. Because in the end, the greatest victory Eowyn Ashgrove ever achieved had nothing to do with titles, estates, or the validation of a society that had ignored her for a decade. The greatest victory was that she had been seen, truly and completely, by someone who understood that a woman kneeling on a cold floor in a worn gray dress, helping a stranger without knowing his name, possessed something more valuable than every diamond, every title, and every ballroom in England. And the world eventually learned what her family discovered far too late. That real worth was never carried in silk gowns or sapphire rings or family names spoken with pride at crowded tables. It lived quietly inside the people who chose kindness when cruelty would have been easier, who chose dignity when the world offered none in return, and who never stopped being gentle, even after years of being told that gentleness was the reason they had failed. It had not been failure at all. It had been the only thing that mattered.